Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, featuring stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life stories for present-day listeners and for generations to come. Our entire collection is available on the website voicesofoklahoma.com. Subscribe to be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. Here's another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com. Marcia Mitchell is the founder of Little Lighthouse, a faith-based mission to assist children with a wide range of developmental disabilities, including autism, Down syndrome, and cerebral palsy. The program is not only a facility for students, but also serves as a training ground for professionals and volunteers throughout the United States and other countries who are learning to reach out to special needs children in their communities. Marcia and her husband Phil gave birth to their daughter Missy, who was born with a rare condition, leaving her legally blind. With no facilities in Tulsa to help Missy, Marcia and her friend Sheryl Pool opened Little Lighthouse in a small building, eventually expanding to a 22,000 square foot facility. In 2013, the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits named Little Lighthouse Oklahoma's top nonprofit organization. In her oral history, Marcia talks about the many unusual circumstances, which Marcia calls miracles, that led to Little Lighthouse serving thousands of special needs children. Here's the story now on the podcast and website, voicesofoklahoma.com.
So today's date is November 15th, 2024, and my name is John Erling. Marcia, would you state your full name, please?
Marcia Jo Mitchell.
And where are we recording this interview?
In my home in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma.
Your birth date?
8/18/1945.
And that makes your present age?
79.
Yeah. This is the only time I get to ask a woman their age.
And get away with
because
it.
It's legitimate, right. I should say that I've known you, you've known me down through the years, but we connected recently since we were both inducted into the Tulsa Historical Society Hall of Fame. We should also say that inducted were Sam Combs, Pat Crofts, and Michelle Hardesty. Now, as we begin to tell this story, I should caution our listeners that if you don't believe in miracles, this may be tough for you to listen to. I'm reminded of when the U.S. hockey team upset the Soviet Union at the 1980 Winter Olympics. Al Michaels famously said, "Do you believe in miracles?" And then he said yes. So if you, the listener, believes in miracles, then come along. So, Marcia, where were you born?
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Your mother's name, maiden name, where she was?
Mary Lou Smith. And she became Mary Lou Mobley.
And where did she come from and grow up?
She grew up here in Tulsa, and some people might remember Mary Lou's Pastry Shops. And my mother was Mary Lou of Mary Lou's Pastry Shops.
Where was that located?
The main bakery was at 18th and Boston. And they had a chain of 9. One was in Utica Square, and then they had branches in Sipes stores and all over Tulsa.
Wow, so you had access to that.
I grew up in the back of a bakery.
What was her personality like?
Very outgoing, very much the life of the party. Both of my parents had extraordinary work ethics.
Your father's name?
William Joseph Mobley.
And he was from where?
He was from Florida. He was a Southerner.
And then how did he come to Tulsa, or how did they meet?
He was working for Armour, and somehow Armour ended up doing business somehow with my mother's parents' bakery. And that's how they met. And eventually my parents went into the bakery business, so my grandfather retired from it. But he had evidently one of the very first bakeries in Tulsa, I think, Miss Smith's Bakery.
And then his personality, what was he like?
My father, very hard worker, very serious, all business.
What would you say you drew from either one of them? Probably that work ethic?
Well, for one, they had us in church from the time we were very little. And yes, I think work ethics, they also, I learned a lot just from watching them. They used a lot of creativity. I never realized it until years later, but I learned a lot about marketing. from them. I remember they had yellow pastry sacks, yellow boxes with blue print on them, said Mary Lou's. So their sacks and their boxes and everything that went out of the bakery with pastries was bright yellow. So if you saw somebody carrying a bright yellow box, you automatically knew it was Mary Lou's. So it was kind of a constant reinforcement, kind of a constant advertisement, and that stuck with me. I think the other thing that really stuck with me is the old phrase, the customer's always right. And they really believed that, and they really adhered to that philosophy. And I watched my mother, as someone might bring in a loaf of bread and say, this just, was a little dry or whatever. And she was always, oh my goodness, well, here, let me give you a fresh loaf of that bread. And by the way, have you tried our new fruit nut bread? Here, you've got to take this home and try it. I watched that, all my growing up years, because they didn't sell the bakeries. They ended up selling it to a corporation of men right after I got married in 1967. So they had it over 20 years.
Wow.
They also taught me hard work. I actually started working in the back of the bakery when I was 4. And worked in the back of the bakery all my growing up years.
What could a 4-year-old do?
Well, you might wonder, but actually my first job, they had these room-size ovens, okay, so a lot of heat coming out of them. But the problem was they also did deliveries to all their branches. So there were these screen doors that were constantly opening and closing. So they were constantly battling any flies that would get in. They had fans to keep them out and so on, but my dad just was, we've got to keep these flies out. So my first job was killing flies. And I got quite good at it. And he paid me a penny a fly.
Oh, that's fine.
And that all worked well until I got so good at it that one day I stayed with it all day long and I killed 100 and I got a $1 bill. First $1 bill I'd ever gotten. I was so excited that I went up front and was telling all the customers about what I earned, how much I earned, how I earned it. I from that point on, I folded boxes. I never got to kill flies again.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I do have a sister, an older sister, and I had a younger sister who passed away when she was 4.5.
Okay.
She was special needs.
Oh, really? That's interesting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. As to what you ended up in. What was her name?
Her name was Kathy Louise.
And then your sister?
Jane Ann. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Grade school? Where did you go?
Lee
Elementary.
Lee Elementary.
Now it's called Council Oak.
Such great memories.
Then on to junior high.
Horace Mann.
And then to high school? And
then transferred. My parents moved out close to, out about 71st and Birmingham when I was in 9th grade, and I started to Edison and went to Edison 9th, 10th, and 11th and 12th grade. Then went to Drury College, Drury University in Springfield, Missouri, and came back home and began teaching at Edison.
In high school, did you participate in any extracurricular activities?
I did. I was in drama club, and so I did a lot of assemblies, the devotionals for assemblies and so on. Was in a couple of the productions, but it wasn't really like a major focus, but I did enjoy that kind of thing.
Did you ever perform? Were you an actress? A little bit. No big lead roles in high school, but then when I got to college as a theater major, I had some major roles. Okay. You said you became a teacher. I came back home and began teaching where I had graduated from Edison. Right. In what year did you graduate from Edison? I graduated in 1963, and I started teaching there in 1967. And that was drama? Speech and drama and English. And then you and Phil, when were you married? In 1967. 1967. All right. I graduated early, actually. I graduated in 3.5 years. Okay. I had gone summer, winter. Because at Drury University they have a summer program, summer theater, and children's theater. We taught creative dramatics to children, and we always did one big production. One summer we did Wizard of Oz, one summer we did Alice in Wonderland. I can't remember what the third one was, but anyway, we did a production each summer. And so because I had gone to summer school and usually took an additional academic course while I was doing that, I had enough credits to graduate at midterm, my senior year. Why did you choose Drury?
Great question. My sister had gone there for a short time, and so I was familiar with it. I loved the idea of, I'm kind of a small campus girl, and I loved the fact that it was a small campus, and I had been told that it was 40 acres of Christian atmosphere.
Oh. How many years then did you teach at Edison?
Three years. So from 67 to 70, and then I retired to have our daughter.
Let's talk about that, because when she was born, obviously you were very excited. But was it in the next 12, 24 hours that you felt, you kind of wondered?
Oh, I cannot tell you how badly I had wanted a baby girl. And everybody had said, you shouldn't want a boy or a girl, you should want a normal, healthy baby. And I wanted a normal, healthy baby girl. And so you just can't even imagine my joy and delight when the doctor said, well, it's a girl. And I just was almost hysterical with joy. And then they brought her around for me to see, and she was beautiful. Went back to my room, had a few moments with my husband. I asked him if he thought there could be anything wrong. And he said, no. And part of the reason was she was her hair was very white. In fact, the nurses had nicknamed her Little Snow White. And there was something about her eyes, couldn't put my finger on it, but so I had slept that night feeling everything's okay. The next morning, pediatrician came in, and he said, well, I guess you have a very special baby. And I said, well, I knew that. I didn't expect everybody to agree, but yes, she's wonderful. And he said, no, I don't think you understand. You see, she's very special because she's very rare. Only 1 in 50,000 babies are born like her. She's been born with a very rare condition, which among other things means that her vision is going to range somewhere between less than normal and blind. You're not going to know where it's going to fall for about 5 years, but I can assure you she will be at best legally blind. And my whole heart and being froze on that one word. And interestingly, John, when I was in college, you asked what roles I had played or had I had any lead roles. One of the lead roles that I was given in college was to play Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker. And so when I heard that word, I didn't hear anything else the doctor was saying. My whole heart and mind and being raced back to actually a time when I was a little girl. And I used to sit out on the porch step reading to a little friend of mine because she was totally blind. We were best friends. And then she introduced me to her piano teacher. And I took piano from him for years, and he was totally blind. And then I went away to college and was awarded that role. And so for 3 months, I prepared for that role. I did all kinds of things blindfolded. I went around the dormitory blindfolded. I had somebody go with me, take me to the grocery store blindfolded. So I did a lot of that kind of research, and I learned so much during that time. It was a wonderful experience. And I came home and began to teach school and discovered I had a blind student in my classroom, totally blind student. And so when I heard that word, my mind just raced back to all of those experiences. And some might think, well, you had to feel prepared, but I didn't. I was crushed. And for the next 3 days, I cried when there weren't any visitors in the room. And I asked one question over and over again. It was, why? Why, Lord? Why? Why have you done this to us? How could you do this to us? I had been a Christian since I was 12, and I just didn't understand how or why. And the third day, Phil was late getting there. He was supposed to have been there earlier. And so like any typical wife, I wanted to know why he was late. he was evasive, which made me more curious. And finally, he began to try to put into words. And he said, as I was driving here, he said, I just began to look at this big wide world and wonder, how will we describe it to Missy? Her name was Michelle, but he immediately nicknamed her Missy. How will we describe it to her if she can't see? And he said, as I thought about that, he said, honey, I just began to look and see things in a way that I had never seen them before. As I searched for words that would describe the sky with those fluffy clouds, you know, the landscape, the grass, he said, all of a sudden I realized it's not just a big green mass, but it's trillions of tiny individual blades of grass. And he said, it's the color and the color contrast. And he said, and I watched a bird in flight, and I thought, how will we describe that to her? And he said, I saw it for the first time. And as he shared with me, I remember looking at the roses by my bedside, and I noticed that they suddenly became more brilliant in color than they had been just moments before. And I think, I've shared with people, I think what happened was that together we began to see in a whole new way. And I think the most important thing we began to see that day was that this was not something God had done to us, but we began to realize this was something God had done for us, because he had blessed us with a baby who had begun to teach us before she could even talk. And strangely, she began to lead us closer to the Lord before she could even walk. And so that day we decided, we knew we had some rough times ahead, but we decided you can't get any more blessed than that.
So then, did you sense then, even the next 2-3 months, her sight was not able to follow?
She was born in August, and we really couldn't tell. We grew concerned because she wasn't developing as rapidly as other babies her age. She wasn't smiling at us when we smiled at her. She did not seem motivated to move about. So I became very, very concerned. And I was, as I mentioned, I was an educator. So as an educator, I knew the importance of early intervention. I knew that the first 6 years of life are the most important learning years we ever experience. And so I was concerned. And so we began to search for a early learning program, a developmental program for visually impaired children and infants, only to discover there was absolutely nothing in Tulsa for those children until they reach the age of 6, which is oftentimes too late. There have been children who reached the age of 6 who were blind or visually impaired, who by the time they reached the age of 6 were so developmentally delayed because of a lack of stimulation and lack of early intervention that they were misdiagnosed and placed in classes for the mentally challenged.
What about her hearing?
Her hearing was amazing. I would be holding her, and all of a sudden she would perk up, and she has nystagmus, which is a jerky movement of the eye, and her eyes would begin to quiver. I think, what is it? And I would listen real carefully, and I'd hear an airplane, or I would hear an ambulance that I hadn't heard before. So yes, her hearing was phenomenal. It is true. It seems like oftentimes they say, when you lose one sense, others begin to compensate, and hers definitely was.
Yeah. So how long did you live with this?
I was a worrier. I'm not proud of that. You were asking me about my parents and kind of what influence they had. One thing I'll always be grateful to my mother for, when I was a little girl, she used to say, I guess I was a worrier from the time I was a kid, because I remember as a little girl, she would say to me, Marcia, honey, don't worry so much. You just pray. And so I was worried. Finally, one day, I remembered that. And I thought, I just have to pray. And so we began to pray that God would send us someone who could help us. Because even though I'd had all those experiences with the blind, I had no idea how to help a blind person. And so I began to pray. And quite by miracle, and it's the only way I can put it. It was someone who told someone who told someone who told someone we knew, who told us about a program in Oklahoma City that worked with deaf, blind children and infants. And that was the closest place we had heard of. And so we wrote to them and asked if they would see us, and they said yes. However, they really just served deaf and blind. So for a month until our appointment, I worried about the fact that Missy wasn't deaf, because I knew she wasn't deaf. So I dressed her up in her best frills. Why I thought that would make a difference, I have no idea, but just in case. I thought I'd make her so adorable, they won't be able to refuse her. Mm-hmm. And so we went over to a place called the Child Study Center in Oklahoma City. They worked with OU Med. It's a big house, old home. And they had social workers and physical therapists and speech therapists. They had a wonderful transdisciplinary team. I remember them having us, we met with a social worker for about an hour, and then we all went to this big room, and they said, just put her down in the floor. And I said, okay. So I sat her down, and there were probably 6 or 7 professionals standing around a circle with us. And as I stepped back away, I thought, oh, Missy, don't do anything wrong. Now, what she could do wrong, I'm not sure, but I didn't want her to do it. And all of a sudden, the first thing she did was she stuck her thumb in her mouth, and I thought, oh, don't do that, don't do that. And with that, one of the professionals swooped her up and said, oh, Missy, that is so good, baby doll, that is wonderful, that is wonderful. And I looked at them like, what? And they said, oh, you don't understand. You see, she has discovered her midline. And I said, her midline? And they said, yeah, her midline. You see, we have an arm on the right, an arm on the left, a leg on the right, leg on the left, and the center is our midline. Our mouth is in our midline. If she has discovered her midline, she can do all kinds of things. She can play with toys where she has to bring both hands together. She can feed herself. There are so many things. This is wonderful. I tell you, my esteem as a parent in that one moment grew, and I learned so much just in that one moment. For one, to appreciate the small milestones, just the tiny milestones. And from that moment on, they were teaching us. And so they developed a program, just on a legal pad. They wrote out different activities that we could do for her when we got home. So basically, we would go over, they would instruct us on how we could help her. For a month, we would carry out those activities and return a month later. They were simple activities. You might think, what can you do with a 5-month-old? Well, they suggested that I wear a certain kind of perfume, same kind, lots of it, all the time. Phil was to wear a certain kind of men's cologne, same kind, lots of it, all the time. Because that way, when we walked into her room, if she could not see, and we still didn't know really, but if she could not see or see very well, she missed what a normal-sighted baby. A normal-sighted baby in a crib sees mommy come into the room and do something over here, do something, and they feel secure. Mommy's here. But a visually impaired baby doesn't get the benefit of that. So if she could smell mommy has come into the room or daddy has come into the room, then they get that. So they taught us all kinds of they had me carry her on my back in an infant carrier for as long as I could stand her. I thought, what's that going to do? Until one morning I tried it, and I went in, had her on my back, and I went in, and I thought, she's smelling bacon frying. She's feeling the heat from the oven door opening and closing and the cold from her refrigerator door opening and closing. She was learning. She felt the vibration in my back as I spoke. She could feel my posture changing. All of these things are things that a blind baby might miss out on. So we learned so much from them and are grateful to this day for their influence.
And felt that she was beginning to progress.
She was. In fact, within a few months, she was functioning on what they said was a normal developmental level. And we were just overjoyed.
Yeah. You probably wanted to talk to somebody in Tulsa, maybe, or even some other parent or parents that had a child like this. Did you find any?
Well, we did, but how do you go about that? But we heard from some friends about some people that we knew of. We didn't know them well, but we just knew of them, and had heard that they too had a visually impaired child. And so, we thought about calling them, but it was awkward. We didn't know how well they had adjusted to their situation, and we just didn't. And little did we know they were hearing about us. They thought about calling us, but they didn't know how well we had adjusted to our situation, and so they felt awkward calling, and so neither called the other. And then I call it the miracle morning. One beautiful spring Sunday morning, we were all ready to go to church, and it takes a lot to get ready to go to church when you have a baby. But Missy and I were standing out next to the driveway waiting for my husband Phil to back the car out of the garage when all of a sudden he closed the garage door and said, "We can't go." And I said, "What do you mean? We're all ready to go to church." He said, "I'm sorry, the car's dead. We can't go." And I said, "But can we just walk to church?" He said, "No, it's about 10 miles to church." I said, "No, I mean just to the church down the street." We had not been there before. So he said, "Okay, but hurry up. I don't want to be late. If there's two things I can't stand, it's be late to church, and the other staff to sit up in front. If we're late, I know we'll end up in front, so hurry up." And so we rushed down the street. It was only a couple of blocks away from our house, and Southern Hills Baptist Church. And I knew how much Phil did not like to have to sit in front, so I was praying that we could slip into the back. But that was not to be, because we stepped into the lobby and it was empty. There was no one there. Stepped into the back of the sanctuary and it was packed. Absolutely packed, and the service had just begun, and I was thinking maybe we should just turn around and slip out, when all of a sudden an usher spotted us, smiled broadly, and motioned for us to come forward. Well, I knew he was already too far forward to suit my husband, but nevertheless we began to follow him, and he kept going and going and going until he reached the second row from the front of the church, where he ushered us into, believe it or not, literally the last two seats available. And those last two seats available just happened to be right next to this couple that we had been hearing about for over a year and a half by that time. We were able to meet their beautiful little girl that day. Their names are Pat and Sheryl Pool. Their daughter's name is Charmin, precious, beautiful child, with some other challenges besides her vision. And we became very, very close friends, and of course told them about the program in Oklahoma City right away.
But isn't there a story behind why were those two seats open?
That's an interesting story, and not many folks know that, but yeah, as a matter of fact, I learned years later that there had been a couple sitting there, and someone had come up from the church, on church staff, and asked if they would be willing to help out in the nursery that morning. And that couple said yes. And because that couple said yes, those two seats were vacated to pave the way for miracles that would continue on for the next 5 decades.
Yeah. So then you were able to tell them then about Oklahoma City, and they didn't know that, did they?
They knew nothing about Oklahoma
Right.
City, and so very soon we were taking the trips together. Just Cheryl, the mother, and Charmin and Missy and I. And it was on our second visit that the professionals there said, "This is not going to work for Charmin. She needs much more than what we can offer to you on a once-a-month basis. She needs daily therapy. She needs daily physical therapy, daily speech therapy. She needs, she needs a lot of help, and we can't do that just once a month." And they said, "Are you sure there's not anything in Tulsa?" And we said, we've been everywhere. And so they just felt bad. And all the way home, we were sad and feeling honestly quite depressed. And then finally one of us, and neither one remembers who said this to who, but one of us said to the other, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if Tulsa could have something like the program in Oklahoma City?" And so the more we thought about that, the more we thought, why not? Surely we could find a director or an administrator, a program that's already in existence that would be willing to start a program like this. It's got to be a school, a hospital, a medical center, someplace. And so when we got home, we began to search. We made a list of all the places we were going to go. And we began to visit all of these different officials. And one by one, they told us the same thing over and over again. I'm sorry, ladies, we don't have the staff. I'm sorry, ladies, we don't have the space. Sorry, ladies, we don't have the budget. I'm sorry, ladies, this is just premature for us, maybe in a few years. Well, we knew that a few years would be too late. And so I was ready to give up, honestly. And Sheryl had this incredible childlike faith. She just believed. She said, no, we're to keep going. And so she said, let's go visit just one more. And that one more was a pediatrician, well-known pediatrician. So we went, we set up an appointment, we went, and by this time we had really practiced our presentation. So when we went in, we told him about all the different places that we had been, all those that we had already consulted with and sought help from, and the time and again that we had been turned down. And when we finally ran out of things to say, there was a silence, and then I remember him sitting up, leaning across his desk, looking over his reading glasses at us and saying, ladies, I'm just going to tell you something. If you want this center, you're going to have to build it yourselves. Well, I had had enough. I was all kinds of done with hearing that, and so I was furious. I thought, he knows there's no way that we can do this. Sheryl was a housewife. I was a retired school teacher. We didn't even know what a 501c3 was, much less did we know how to start a 501c3 or a center. We were seeking help because we didn't know how to do it. So it was ludicrous for him to say such a thing as that to us. And so I expressed my irritation all the way down the hallway. And then I expressed my irritation all the way to the car. In fact, we had been sitting in the car for quite some time, and I was still expressing my irritation when all of a sudden it dawned on me, Sheryl hadn't said a word. In fact, she was sitting there with the most angelic-looking expression on her face. And then it hit me. I said, oh, Sheryl, you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. And she smiled, and I said, Sheryl, we wouldn't even know where to begin to start a program like that. And she smiled, and she said 3 words, but God does. I said, okay, I know that's true. But Sheryl, if all those doctors and administrators think it's going to be so expensive, I don't even want to know how expensive it would be, and we don't have a dime to begin a program like that. And she smiled and she said, but God does. And John, for the first time in my life, I came face to face with a question, and that was, did I really believe what I had always said I believed? When I was a little girl, I used to memorize scriptures about how God could do anything, and I got little stars on a chart for it. And in Sunday school, I would sing hymns about how God could move mountains. And all my growing up years, I had believed that God could do anything. I had had a close relationship with the Lord, and I had always believed that, but did I really? Because here we were facing a situation where we had nowhere else to go but God. And so, in short, I decided I had to find out the answer to my question. And so I, with a great deal of fear and trembling, took Sheryl's hand of strong, childlike faith, and we dared to believe God for a 20th century miracle, and we took a giant leap of faith.
Where did that leap take you?
Oh my. That was in the spring of 72. And so, now I have to tell you, her husband was in the banking business. Mine was in the savings and loan business. both of them extremely conservative. And so you can only imagine their expressions when we walk in and say, guess what we're going to do? And when I told my husband, the newspaper had slowly come down, and he said, honey, you don't have a beginning knowledge of how to do that. And I said, I know, but God does. He said, yeah, but you don't have any money, and you're going to need a lot of money. And I said, I know, but God does. And I just began to quote Sheryl, but Sheryl was quoting Scripture. And you know, when you begin to really believe Scripture, God can do amazing things. And so I think it was kind of like you would pat a child on the head and say, okay, go build your playhouse or go build your fort or whatever. That's pretty much what their reaction was. But we began to pray, and we knew, our husbands made sure we knew we were going to have money. And of course we knew that. We didn't know how much. But it just so happened, right at that very same time, there was a Lions Club auxiliary that was trying to get back together. They had kind of dissolved. And Phil was a Lions Club member, and I went to that meeting. And one of the ladies said, well, I tell you what, I would really like to reorganize. But if we do, I don't want to just sit around and sip tea all day. I want to do something meaningful. I want to do something we can really sink our teeth into and make a difference. I mean, really make a difference in Tulsa. She kept going on like this, and I was with someone who knew a little bit about our dream. And she finally nudged me and she said, why don't you tell them about your dream and your idea? And so I did. And that evening when I left that house, there were 15 other ladies dreaming our dream. And not only that, but we had decided to have our first fundraising event. I was so excited. I had never ever been a part of one of these before, but we decided to have a garage sale. We scheduled it for soon thereafter, and it rained the whole weekend. But my spirits were not dampened. I walked into the living room and I said to my husband, well, honey, guess how much we made? And he said, how much? And I said, $65. He lowered that paper again. He said, oh, honey, you don't understand. You're going to need at least $2,000 to $3,000 just to get your doors open. That's assuming you've got doors to open, which you don't. You don't have a location. You don't have anything right now. So that afternoon I was out driving and returning some things, running errands. And I said, God, it's up to you now, because I have no idea how to raise $2,000 to $3,000. And if that's what it's going to take, you're going to have to tell us how. And I haven't seen that much money raised since. And then it suddenly hit me. My last responsibility at Edison, when I was teaching, was to direct the 9th grade play. And we had done The Wizard of Oz, and I had had the most talented students on the planet, I thought. And so I thought, well, we raised about $1,200 for that class. And I thought, maybe, I've never been really great at finances, but I thought maybe if we did it several times rather than just one show, we could raise 2 or 3 times as much. So I went home and I called Sheryl and I told her the idea. And as I was telling her the idea, I was getting more and more scared about how would we actually do this. But when I finished telling her, she said, that's it. That's what we're to do. We're to do, you can direct that play. You can do it all over again. And I said, but Sheryl, I haven't seen my students in 2 years. I don't even know where they are. I don't even know how to reach them. She said, don't worry, God will make a way. And you just start trying to reach them. You start, working on that. And anyway, she got all excited and her childlike faith kicked in. And to make a long story short, within the next month and a half, all of those kids had agreed to come back and do that production one more time. Some of them still had their costumes. My Tin Man did too, but his costume was made of sheet metal and he had grown 6 inches, so it didn't work. But at the end of August, we had done, I think, six different showings of The Wizard of Oz. The Recreation Center for the Physically Limited had allowed us to use their auditorium. We had raised close to $3,000.
Wow.
And on the last night, I was standing at the back, so proud of my students. It was really a wonderful play. One of the workers at the rec center was standing next to me, and I'd kind of gotten to know him a little bit. He was a driver and did all kinds of things for them there. And he said, by the way, he said, where's your center going to be? And I said, I don't know. He said, did you know that there was just an article in the paper that said you're opening in 3 weeks? And I said, yeah. And he said, but you don't know where you're opening? And I said, no. He said, what are you looking for? I said, we just need a little place. We had found 3 other children, or they had found us. They had heard what we were doing, and so we had five students. We knew we wanted 5 volunteers. The Child Study Center in Oklahoma City was going to guide our teacher who had just graduated from Tulsa University. And I said, so we just need a little place. And I began to describe to him, and he said, you know what? He said, we've got a place like that just next door that we're just using for storage. Why don't you come around in the morning and let me show it to you and see if that might work for you? And
Next door of the Recreation Center for
Yes,
Physically
yes.
Limited. Okay.
1007 South Utica.
Okay.
And so the next morning I met him. We literally had to fight our way through the shrubs to get to the front door. It was so overgrown because they were just using it for a storage place. And I went in and it was perfect. There was even a sink that was down at child height. And I understand that at one time it had been a doctor's office. And so for some reason he had kept the sink down low so he could just sit on one of those stools and roll over to it. And a perfect little room for parents to be able to observe between 2 classrooms. It was perfect. It was probably only about 700 square feet. It was tiny, but it was beautiful. We knew we were going to have to strip the floors and repaint the walls and do some major work on the yard to be able to even let people in the front door. And I hand painted a sign. If you could see it, you would understand why I'm not real proud of it. But I hand painted a sign with a lighthouse on it. And we had been actually working one day on my dining room table when our attorney had called and said, I'm working on these papers for you. What are you calling this? We hadn't even thought about that. So we said, we'll call you back. So we thought, well, there's a lighthouse for the blind in New York. So this is going to be for little ones. So maybe we could call it Little Lighthouse. And so we had gotten in touch with them and asked if they would allow us to use that name. And they said yes. And so the Little Lighthouse was born. And on October 3rd, 1972, 5 little children and 5 volunteers, one very dedicated teacher who had agreed to take the job before we could guarantee her of a salary or a roof over her head, began.
And her name?
Christy Schneider. Christy Danes Schneider. And she was amazing. When we ran out of space, which we did within 9 months, our pupil enrollment had tripled within the 9 months, she came up with the idea to attach the little children's chairs to ropes, and we would hoist them up to the ceiling and then lower them back down for snacks and lunch. But during playtime, they would be hoisted up to the ceiling. She came up with all kinds of amazing, brilliant ideas and sought help from the Child Studies Center, who eventually felt like we were moving on our own, and so they returned to Oklahoma City, and we continued on our own.
So then, did you have volunteers?
We had 5 volunteers that first morning. We started our day with what we called flock. I think Christy came up with that term. And the Little Lighthouse has flock to this day, and flock is the time when our staff come together to pray and to have devotionals each morning, and they are still doing that to this day, even though there's, I think, over 80 on staff now. So it's a bigger group. But anyway, that was our beginning. At the very beginning, someone advised us we should have tuition. And we followed that advice for just the first year, and it was $10 a month. Hardly even worth speaking of, but we had parents who couldn't pay that. They had been so devastated by all the medical expenses they had incurred that they were just wiped out. And so we did away with the tuition. And it has been tuition-free since 1973.
Can only imagine the thrill that these parents who didn't even know who to talk to initially, those that came to the little lighthouse that day, how thrilled they must have been. They connected with people who had the same kind of problem.
John, so much of my time, when I remember those early days, hours and hours and hours of my time was spent on the phone by parents calling, I hear that you're starting this. And they were so desperate for somebody just to talk to. I would be on the phone for hours talking to these parents. And yes, they were absolutely jubilant to finally have said, well, little boy had been born without a nose. And they'd had to build him a nose. And so he had had extensive challenges. Had another little boy who was hydrocephalic and cerebral palsy, severe brain damage. Had another little boy. I mean, they were all so different. Another little boy was totally blind. He had 2 glass eyes. Then there was Charmin, with her physical challenges. And then there was Missy, who just was visually impaired. And trust me when I say, after seeing all the multiple problems and learning that at that time the average child with special needs had 2.2 handicapping conditions. So very quickly we realized this can't just be for the blind, because we were having to meet the other needs. In other words, this child's blind, but he also has cerebral palsy. We've got to have a physical therapist. This child's blind, but he also has these other needs. And so because we ended up having to add physical therapy, occupational therapy, et cetera, speech pathology, et cetera, we within 2 years, or within a year and a half, dropped the requirement that they be visually impaired and began to accept any child with any special need.
So did you come then with a need for a full-time director?
Yes, immediately we knew we needed that. There's so much to do. We had no forms for parents to fill out. We had no forms for employees to fill out. We had nothing. We didn't even have a file cabinet. And Sheryl was pregnant at the time, and so by default, I got to play that role. I started out as executive director and ended up remaining in that role for 41 years.
Did you have furniture? What were the physical needs?
We didn't have, I take that back. We did have, I think that our husbands there was kind of an irony here. They said we could have $65, which is how much we had raised on that first garage sale to buy equipment. And so we went to the Tulsa Public School warehouse. And I don't know if you know this, but they still sell stuff dirt cheap there. We were able to get huge bookcases for like $7. So we got children's tables and chairs and bookcases to hold our equipment and so on there. That's kind of how it all began. I think we were able to get a desk from there too. They didn't have any file cabinets. So we began to pray for a file cabinet. I don't know if you've read the story, but one day a file cabinet starts coming through this way, a very narrow door. My office was the entry hall to this little house. And I look up and there's this file cabinet coming through the front door, and I think, what on earth? I knew we didn't have the money for it. And so the guy finally got on the other. I said, sir, I'm sorry, but we did not order a file cabinet. He said, well, I was told to deliver this to this address. And I said, well, you're going to have to take it back because we can't afford it and we didn't order it. So you're going to have to return it. He said, lady, I was told to bring this here and I'm leaving it. And it turned out that one of the ladies from the auxiliary that I'd helped to organize, she had picked up on the fact that we needed a file cabinet and had it donated. And we learned something because we had prayed for it, and we learned something that day. We had to pray very specifically for things, and we began to pray probably one story that I haven't shared in years, the children, whether they were eating or they were doing finger paints, whatever, they would end up covered with whatever. And so we knew we needed smocks for them, just little aprons. We had looked into it, but my sister had looked into seeing if she could find some for us, and we decided it was too expensive. We couldn't afford them. But she had gone into a well-known little kids' clothing shop, One day I was out with her. She said, let's run in. There was one, I think it was called Marge McNerney's. She said, let's run in. I said, I don't have time. I've got to get home. She said, please, just for a few minutes. So we walked in this place. And I've not said a word to anyone. And this lady that works there walks up to me. And she's got this catalog. Not a word has been spoken. But this lady walks up. She's, aren't you Marcia Mitchell? And I said, yes. And she introduced herself, and she said, I understand that you need some smocks at the little lighthouse for your children. And I said, yes. And she said, well, will these work? And she's pointing to these darling smocks. I said, yes. And she said, well, if there's something wrong with these, we've got look at these. There's all kinds in here. You can just take your pick. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't understand. It was obviously merchants, the price. I couldn't figure it out. And I said, how much are they? And she said, oh, you don't need to worry about that. And I said, well, I'm afraid we do. She said, no. This is on us. You just pick out however many you want and what colors you want, and I will get them. Well, I am like, what on earth? And so finally, I walked up to the counter and I said, ma'am, I'm really sorry, but have we met? How did you know me? And she said, well, there was an article in the paper the other day about the little lighthouse, and your picture was a part of that article, and so I recognized you. And a while back, somebody was in here asking about smocks, but I'd never heard of the little lighthouse at that time. But after reading that article, and I recognized you from the picture, you walked in here, and I just knew God was telling me I'm supposed to donate those smocks. And so, I left that day just so in awe of God. We could have gone to any other children's clothing shop, but God had directed us there. And that was one of just countless miracles that we experienced during those first few years, just God's divine, miraculous provision.
So then I would imagine the enrollment was increasing, and then how are you going to get all these children into that little lighthouse?
Well, we were bulging at the seams. In fact, we knew that any time they were going to come in and say, you can't keep operating here, the health department or whoever. So we began to pray again that God would somehow give us a bigger place. And one day, this gentleman is a real character. His name was Don Morey, a wonderful guy. He was an administrator of a church nearby, and he walked in. He was an all business kind of guy. And he said, I'm administrator for Emmanuel Baptist Church, and we're not too far from here, and my wife has been on my case to come by here. And she saw something on TV about y'all the other night, and she said, I need to come by here. So I'd like a tour. Well, I took him on a tour, which took about 2 minutes because it wasn't far to go. We came back in, and he said, this is a really good program you have here. And I said, well, thank you. He said, but this is the most rinky-dink facility I've ever seen. And he said, you need a bigger place. And I said, yes, we do. He said, well, okay, thank you for the tour. He left. And the next day he called, and he said, tomorrow's Saturday, I'd like for you to meet me at Emmanuel Baptist Church. You and that little teacher of yours meet me? I said, okay. So he said, there's something I want to show you. I said, okay. So I went and told Christy. Well, the part of the story that I love, because Christy was she was so in tune with the Lord. A few days prior to that, I had walked in. She was sitting at one of the children's tables, which served as her desk. She had a big piece of butcher paper out there. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm designing our next facility. I said, okay. And she said, Marcia, it's going to be wonderful. I think the ideal thing would be to have like a big room with some like little rooms off of it. So we could take the children into those little rooms and do one-on-one with them. And she said, and then over here we'd have another big room with some other little rooms off of it. And I said, Christy, we're barely making it month to month. We never know where the money's going to come from. There's no way that we can afford a place like that. And she looked at me just incredulous, and she said, Marcia, God knows our needs. And if God knows our needs, He's preparing a place for us. And if He's preparing a place for us, I just want to make sure He understands exactly what we need. So she was designing the blueprints for God. Well, that Saturday, we met this gentleman at Emmanuel Baptist Church. He took us up to the third floor of Emmanuel Baptist Church. And he said, now you're not going to be able to go in here. But he said, I want to open this. And he opened the door, and it was a huge room, stacked with chairs. It was wall-to-wall chairs, stacked up 3 and 4 high. And he said, we can't go in because we're using this for storage. He said, but those doors over there just open up to little tiny classrooms. They're little bitty. But there's, as you can see, there's like 5 or 6 over there. He took us down the hall, another big room with little rooms off of it, exactly matching Christy's blueprint. And so he offered us that space. The church approved it. Very soon thereafter, we had moved into our second facility, Emmanuel Baptist Church.
So then I would imagine the enrollment grew and then
continued to grow.
And then that means money, expenses to meet every month. I believe your husband Phil had some concerns.
Oh, he did.
Money.
He did. He, bless his heart, having his father was in the savings loan business. He was in the savings and loan business, and that's when savings and loans were, at their peak, and it was hard for him. And he had taken over just kind of managing the finances. We had put a board of directors together, but he was really the only finance guy on the board. And one day he said, honey, we can't keep operating this way. We just can't. You have to understand, my husband's an easygoing sort. He's very laid back, kind of opposite of me. And he was pacing, which I found quite amusing because I had never seen him pace or stew. And he was stewing and he was pacing. And I said, what is going on? And he said, we've got to have $1,200. We've got to have $1,200 at the end of this week. We don't have it. And he said, we never have that much money come in, and he said, I don't know. Honey, you don't understand. We have to pay these bills. I mean, you just kind of, by faith, blindly go along, but we have to pay these bills. And I said, well, I know. But I said, look at what all God's done and how He's provided. I said, surely He'll provide again. He said, $1,200? I said, well, I realize that's a lot. That's a lot. Well, the next day, I walked in, and sometimes people would send the checks to our home address just because they knew of us or whatever. Well, the Lions Club had our address. They didn't have the Lighthouse address. The Lions Club had sent a check. I walked in, and Phil's standing there looking very sheepish. I said, what? He said, you are not gonna believe this. And I said, what? He said, the Lions Club has decided to begin donating $200 a month to the little lighthouse. I said, you're kidding. That's wonderful. And he said, that's not all. They've decided to make it 6 months retroactive. So this check is for $1,200. And then he looked at me and he said, I'll never doubt again. And he would, if he were sitting here, he would tell you that sure there were those times when he did, but it was a huge thing for him. It was a huge faith boost for him. And it was just one more time when God had demonstrated that if we will pray and if we will trust, that He will make a way and He will provide. Okay. So we continued on walking by faith, and God continued to provide. And 50 years later, the most remarkable thing, and I pray my world can hear this, that in 50 years, even though we have no federal funding, we do not receive United Way, we do not receive insurance reimbursements, and no tuition. So we really do not ever know where the money is going to come from. Our budget is now over $4 million a year, but we've never gone a dime in debt. Even our facility, which we finally were able to move into our first permanent home site in 1990. We had moved into another church that was all on one floor, which was wonderful. Southside Christian Church were gracious enough to allow us space there. And from there, we finally were able to move into our first permanent facility that we were able to design specifically for children with special needs at 36th and Yale, where we still are. And that first facility was a $2 million project, and it was built debt-free.
But let me come back. You entered into an agreement with Tulsa Public Schools.
Yes.
So that's state or federal money, I suppose, that's coming.
Well, they approached us and asked if we would provide programs for children that were demanding services, because at that point in time, Public Law 94-142 had been passed, which provides a free and appropriate education to every child with special needs in the least restrictive setting. So the public schools were having more and more families demanding services. We had approached them to see if they would provide therapists for us early on, and they had laughed and said, we can't put, we were in the little house at the time, they said, we can't put our therapists over there. And I can understand. So then once we moved into Emmanuel, they had heard a lot about us, and they called and asked if they could have a tour. And so we said, of course, and so we took them on a tour, and they were very impressed. The program had really developed by that time, and we had hired some therapists and so on at that point in time, but we desperately needed teachers because our teachers were really, really overextended. And so the head of special ed department at that time came into my office and he said, you've got an incredible program going on here. He said, you're doing what they're really asking us to do. He said, how about if we enter into a contractual agreement where these kids that are wanting services, we send them over to you. We put those kids and your kids on both Little Lighthouse rolls and public school rolls. And he said, we will hire some additional teachers for you. We've got some great additional equipment for you. It's pretty high-tech equipment. This was like a dream for us. We'll just enter into this agreement. And it sounded good. I remember asking him if separation of church and state could be a problem. And his response was, don't worry about it, just don't say anything. We entered into that agreement, and that lasted for about 3 years.
Well, then the enrollment had to really grow then.
It grew dramatically. It skyrocketed. We had over 30 kiddos by 3 years later. A pretty substantial staff that represented all the different therapies and so on. But there were problems that arose with some families that disagreed with the fact that we were praying in the classrooms. We had Bible posters on the wall. We used a Bible-based curriculum, and we prayed in the classrooms. And so there were families that disapproved of that. And they went to the public schools, and really, public schools didn't have much choice. They demanded that public schools demand that we cease prayer in the classrooms, the Bible-based curriculum, take the Bible posters down, that we eliminate all of that. And John, the fact of the matter was we knew God opened those doors. And we had made Christ the cornerstone. And we didn't feel that we could turn our back on him. He had provided for us. He had made it possible for it to open. It was his ministry. We knew the only way that it was there is because of him. And so our board of directors met way into the night, 2:00 in the morning, one night. At the end of the meeting, they had determined that we would not compromise. We did lose a few board members who disagreed. They felt like we couldn't possibly make it without public schools. And so we went through a very difficult time in the next year and a half because they did pull out, and pretty much close to overnight. I mean, it was in a matter of just like a month or two. They had pulled out. We had lost the teachers, therapists, the equipment. Our pupil enrollment dropped from over 30 down to 5. Actually, it was 3 or 4. I think it went back to 5 pretty quick, but it was a very small number. Many of our staff ended up going to work for public schools. Really, the only ones that were left were those who were totally devoted followers of Christ that believed Christ should be the cornerstone or the ministry should not be. And they remained. But we went through a very, very difficult year and a half.
So then you had to wonder if the school should even continue.
I did. And there were times when one time in particular, I said, God, why? Why? Because it was hard. You know, it was like we were barely existing. And so donations fell off. Our staff were voluntarily going without paychecks, sometimes up to 7 payroll periods. And so I felt responsible as the head of it. It was hard. And I remember one time saying, God, this makes no sense. You know, this public law has been passed. Public schools now have to do this. Why don't you just let us close? Why don't you just let us close? And I got no answer. When did you ever, finally, just frustration and irritation, I said, when did you ever ask anybody else to do anything that made no sense whatsoever? And I was silent. And then just one word came to my mind and heart: Noah. And I thought, yeah, that didn't make sense. Why should he build a boat? You know, there was no rain. Why? It made no sense. He was building something that made no sense. And there was a wonderful board member at that time, and I shared my story with him, that experience. And I remember him saying, Marcia, that was God speaking. And one day, there is going to be a flood of children that is going to need this ark. We are to keep building. Well, today, we have almost 500 children on our waiting list. We're serving over 250 each year. Jerry was right. There was a flood coming, and God did know what he was doing. And Christ is still the cornerstone at the Little Lighthouse.
And so when we see that facility at 36th and Yale, that's really an ark.
It's an ark. It is an ark,
Right.
for sure.
Right. Christy, who was your first teacher, did she stay with you through all of this, or what?
She married, and her husband is a pastor, and so they had to move away. They were in another town, but she was a godsend, literally a godsend, and I will be forever grateful. God also raised up several others that, on a spiritual level, were mentors to me, spiritual mentors. I had been a Christian since I was 12, and even in college, I led devotionals in my dorm and so on. But you know, I'd never really been taught how to pray. I had never really been taught how to study the Word of God. You know, I read a little scripture each night before I closed my eyes and went to sleep. But I really had never been taught how to pray specifically. And these young women happened to have graduated from Tulsa University, and they were part of Wesleyan Foundation at TU. And they had truly been discipled, and they discipled me. And had they not, I don't know how I would have made it.
So I know you were in a financial funk, I'm going to call it. Miracles were not happening like they had been. Staff was going without paychecks. Depression, I suppose, would set in, and maybe at home they were told, you've got to bring in more money. So about that.
Things continued to go in that direction. It lasted a year and a half, which, you know, I can say that so easily, a year and a half, but let me tell you, a year and a half is a long time when you're really struggling. Finally, our board of directors, they were so concerned that we were all beginning to question, is this really God? Does he really want us to continue? And so we had read a little bit about fleeces in the Bible. Our board decided to lay a fleece before God. And they decided to ask God, it was a very large amount of money, to come in. We needed enough to come in several months to bring our staff. We asked him to provide enough to pay our staff to date, everyone. And by the way, every staff member got paid in full, ultimately, just late. But that was by their volunteering themselves to do that. So our board felt like, we just can't keep doing this. And so they said, Lord, if you want us to keep going, we ask that by January 1st of 1978, I believe it was, that we will have enough money to have our staff paid to date and all bills paid. I don't remember the exact amount, but I do remember that we meant it. The other thing was that we were all well determined, agreed. No one would tell anyone on the outside about this fleece. No one was allowed to contribute to it because we didn't want to manipulate it. We wanted to know it was from God. And so we just said, God, if you want this, that you've got to provide. And it won't come from any of us. It's going to have to come from people who don't know about this fleece. And so the day before January 1st, 1978, I went down to the office, and we were actually on break, and I went down, and John had poured so much of my heart and soul into this. I just, I had such mixed feelings because in a way I was so tired. I just wanted it over, to be honest. But on the other hand, I just felt like it was of God. And I just couldn't imagine that it would close. The families that were still there were so grateful for it and loved the fact that it was a Christian center. And so I went in to get the mail. We still needed $1,000. And I got the mail, and I sat down and began opening it. And the first envelope was for a couple of $100, and the next one was for like $100, and there was one envelope left. And I said, God, this is up to you. It's yours. And you opened it. It's up to you to close it. And I opened that last envelope. It was a check for $1,000. And I just began to weep. Come to find out, that was from a couple. I later found out, months later, it was from a couple who had already given us a check for $1,000 earlier. But they felt strangely impressed that they were to give another check for $1,000. And I was able to tell them how God had used them. And from that time on, God has continued to provide and continued to bless the ministry.
You were beginning to think that you needed a permanent location.
Yes, desperately. The church was, needing more and more of their own space. They had been so gracious to us, Southside Christian. Yeah, they had been so gracious to us, allowed us to go in and remodel their educational building. But we knew we needed our own facility, and it took us about 7 years. But we began to look for, buildings, and everything we found was just wouldn't work. Children with special needs have very specific needs in the way of facility. There's a lot of things that just, you don't want a lot of stairs, and it's just a lot of things. And we just couldn't find, we would get pretty serious about something and then it would fall through. But early on, we found this one piece of property, in our dreams we would build. We found this one piece of property, and it was at 36th and Yale. It was on a hill, and I don't know, it just seemed so perfect. One of the reasons is because we wanted to be equally distanced between ORU and Tulsa University, because we had a lot of volunteers and students come and do practicums there, and so that would be ideal. And 36th and Yale was right there. We thought ideally we would be across the street from a park. It was right across the street from a park. And maybe even next door to a church where we could share parking. It was right next door to a church where we could share parking. I mean, everything was perfect. In fact, right after we saw it, we nicknamed it the Promised Land. So we began to really look into it, only to find out that, well, before that, I called a friend of mine who lived about a block over. She went for a walk every day, rain or shine, from what I understand. And she would pray as she walked. So I called her and I said, Phyllis, I've got something for you to pray about. I said, we believe in praying specifically. And she said, oh, yes. I said, well, here's the deal. We have fallen in love with this property at 36. She said, oh, yeah, I walk by there every day. And I said, well, could you pray that the little lighthouse could have that property? And she said, I absolutely will. So anyway, we began to look into it, only to find that it was tied up in some legal issues with zoning and so on, and the owner wasn't interested in selling. So we continued for 2 years to look at other properties. A couple of years later, I'm in my office, and my assistant comes in and says, Marcia, there's this gentleman on the phone who wants to talk to you. I said, okay. And so I picked up the phone. I said, hello. He said, is this Marcia Mitchell? I said, yes. He said, this is, and he identified himself. I knew of him. I had run into him at church, but I didn't know him well. He said, I have a question for you. There's a deep voice. I have a question for you. And I said, okay. And he said, did God tell you that the little lighthouse is to be located at 36th and Yale? And I said, I beg your pardon? He said, did God tell you that the little lighthouse is to be located at 36th and Yale? And I said, well, I will tell you this, that we love that property. We've nicknamed it the Promised Land, and it would be perfect for what we want. We have wished that we could get that property. I said, why are you asking? And he said, well, because I own that property. And he said, I've been dealing with it for some time. And he said, I've got an opportunity to sell it. And he said, but the weirdest thing, he said, I keep waking up, and I keep having this dream and keep waking up with this thought that the little lighthouse is supposed to be there. He said, but I can't afford to give it to you. And he said, so I finally went and talked to my dad, who's my kind of a financial advisor to me. And I told my dad, I just keep having this crazy idea. And but I've got this great opportunity. It was kind of, I think, out of Texas. He said, I've got this great opportunity. And he said, it's just kind of crazy that I keep having this reoccurring thought. Don't you agree? It's crazy. And his dad said, yeah, unless God does want the little lighthouse there. And he went, Dad. Well, anyway, he just kind of said, well, my wife she's good at usually business head on her shoulders. And so I went to her. I said, Gwen, I keep having this crazy thing, and told her all about it. And I said, it doesn't make sense. He said, there's no way I can give that to them, or even they can't afford what I need. And he said, it's crazy, isn't it? He said, yeah, unless God does want them there. Well, by this time he was exasperated, and so he finally thought, I'm not going to talk to them about it anymore. I'm going to go talk to my financial advisor at my bank, and I'm not going to tell him about this crazy thing that keeps happening to me. I'm just going to tell him I'm ready to sell and ask him what he thinks about this deal. So he did. He tells him all about it and the offer that he's had, and he said, what do you think? And Jim said, so you're ready to sell? And he said, yeah, I am. I'm ready to sell. He said, well, if you're ready to sell, would you consider selling to the little lighthouse? And Ralph said, you got to be kidding me. So he said, so I came back to my office, and that's why I'm calling you. I just need to know, did God tell you? And long story short, as you know, we did end up, it took us years to raise the amount of money that we needed, but we were able to eventually raise it and moved into that facility debt-free.
And so then you're thinking about more money for building and all that kind of thing. Is there another miracle working here?
Yes, there was miracle after miracle in terms of the amount that we needed to be able to build that. And then years later, as you may know, we expanded that facility because we had such a long waiting list. I think that total was $16 million. So it's now a 60,000 square foot facility that's tailor designed to meet the needs of children with special needs.
Here's a great story about this little gentleman who came to your door.
It's a wonderful lesson for me. One day, I had this great gal, darling personality, loved to talk. The only problem was she loved to talk more than she liked to do administrative work, and I really needed her to do administrative work. And so one day I was leaving for a speaking engagement, and I was very burdened because we had just had a fundraiser that had been rained out, and they weren't able to have it, and we weren't able to have it, or people were going to do it for us. We're not able to carry through with it. So I was just burdened about that. Anyway, so I was heading out, and I said, Laura, listen, I really need for you to focus today because we've got to get this done. And I said, now, we were on break. The children weren't there. And I said, so if anybody comes, please welcome them. But please try not to, try not to get too involved chatting, okay? So, okay. Well, so this gentleman, kind of khaki pants and kind of a threadbare shirt, walks in and said, I was wondering if Mrs. Mitchell is here. And she said, no, I'm sorry, she's not. And he said, well, I really wanted to meet with her. I wanted to know more about this place. And she said, well, I could tell you. So of course, she goes right into her chat mode, and she takes him on a tour and comes back and sits down and in her wonderful way begins to talk with him. And she said, well, what brings you our way? And he said, well, my wife loved this place and she died. And he said, I just wanted to come see what this place was all about that she was always talking about. And he said, I want to come back when Mrs. Mitchell is here. Do you know when she'll be back? And she told him, he said, I'll be back, but I don't want you to tell her that I'm coming. Okay? She said, okay. She didn't. That afternoon, I was walking out of my office, and this old gentleman walks in. I said, well, hello, how are you? And introduced myself, and he said, do you have a few minutes? I said, I sure do. Come on in. He came in, and he took out his hanky, and he just began to weep, and he's telling me about his wife, and he said, she loved this place. She really loved this place. I lost her recently. And he said, she wanted me to bring you a gift. I was going to do it, but I really wanted to see what this place was all about first. And I especially wanted to see if you all would take time for an old man. Your assistant did, and you did. And so I want to give you this from my wife and I. It was for the exact amount that we had just lost on this failed fundraiser.
So what was the amount of the check?
$6,000.
Wow.
It was just the exact amount that we needed. And I learned a lot that day. God really impressed upon my heart, you know what? Love all people, treasure all people, take time for all people, and trust Him. I also realized the value of my precious assistant or secretary at that time, that her wonderful way with people, God was using in a mighty way. So I never again said to her, try to stay focused.
Right. But your staff had been sacrificing. I think you needed $18,000 to pay the staff in full, $12,000 to keep all bills paid. You basically needed then a total of $30,000. And then one day, a lawyer calls
Oh, yeah. That actually has happened any number of times where we have needed a specific amount and had an attorney call and say, there's been an estate that has been tied up in probate, but I'd like to bring a check over to you, and it's been for the exact amount. At one point, it was about $30,000. At another time, years later, decades later, it was $400,000.
So your board said for adequate funding for the rest of the year, you needed $219,000. And by the target date, that amount had actually been received. So then you build new building, as you've already referred to, debt-free basis. So your board had decided we're going to build a building now. Obviously, we have the land.
So we needed an architect. The board narrowed it down to 3 architectural firms, and I was to do the final decision. The one thing we knew is that the needs of these children are so unique, and we didn't want it to be a cookie-cutter school. So I met with the first group. They walked in, they were tie and sharp and slick, and they had big portfolios, and they showed me all that they had done. It was very impressive. And my question to each one was, what have you done that would qualify you to build such a unique facility that has such unique needs as ours? And like I said, they would pull out these beautiful pictures of buildings that they had done and so on. And so that was the first. The next group came, kind of same thing, coat, tie, very professional, sat down, and kind of same scenario. Then the next guy came in, and he's in a tie, but you can tell he is really uncomfortable. I had met him. I didn't know him well, but I had met him, and his name was Jim Stanton. Jim said, Marcia, do you mind if I take this tie off? He said, I'm not used to wearing a tie. Took a tie off, or loosened his tie anyway. So we talked a little bit about the building, and I said, Jim, what have you all done that would uniquely qualify you to build a facility that has such specific needs as this has, and not your typical cookie cutter? And he looked at me and he said, boy, my boss would probably kill me for saying this. He said, but I got to be honest with you. He said, I don't know that we've done anything that would qualify us to do this. He said, Marcia, I would have to be on my knees every inch of the way. And I knew right then and there he was our man. And he was the architect that we hired and did a magnificent job.
So then you broke ground July 27, 1989. So then a Rotarian called. Here we have another
We had no playgrounds. We were going to be playing mud pies a lot because we had no playgrounds. And out of the blue, I had forgotten about this. This has been years ago. A Rotarian called and said, we've got an anniversary. There's Downtown Rotary. We've got an anniversary coming up. And we want to do something special. And I think it was going to be, they were going to be wanting to spend it in the neighborhood of $75,000. And he said, he said, I told this committee of men, I do not want to just build a monument to people to look at in Tulsa. We've got enough monuments. Let's do something that's going to make a difference. And he said, so I'm calling you to ask, is there a need that you have that hasn't been met yet for this building? And I said, are you serious? And he said, absolutely. And I said, we have no playgrounds. And he said, that sounds like a great project. He said, let me take it back to the group. So he did. The Rotarians approved it. Well, the only thing is they needed somebody to design these unique playgrounds for these kids. Can't be your typical playground. So I called Jim. I said, Jim, I know you're not a landscape architect, you're a building architect, but can you help us with this? He said, Marcia, I don't have any training in that. He said, but let me kind of check around and see if I can see what I can learn about it. And he called the architect for the city of Tulsa, I think his name was Greg Warren, said, "Can you advise me on this?" He said, "I don't know what I'm doing, but they don't have any money to hire anybody, and they've got somebody wanting to do these playgrounds. Can you advise me on this? Because you've done playgrounds all over the city of Tulsa." The guy said, "Who's this for?" He said, "The little lighthouse." He said, "I just enrolled my daughter there. I will design your playgrounds." God just constantly amazed us with how through his divine connections. You know, you've heard the old saying, you got to have connections. My saying is you've got to have God, because God has divine connections.
Then you had other contributing to additions. Ronald McDonald Children's Charity and Farmers Insurance Group contributed additions. Then you needed for your building automatic doors.
Yes, we desperately, because the parents are, pushing strollers through the doors. They can't, it's impossible. We had to have automatic opening doors, and we needed a double set of them, and those were going to be very expensive. And the builders kept saying, we need to know if y'all are going to do this or not. But they were so expensive, they're kind of out of our budget. Actually, Jean Winfrey, who was with me at my side for the majority of my 41 years there, she had an incredible faith, and she could better tell this story, but bottom line, she ended up getting a phone call with an offer saying, "What do you need?" I think it's from Walt Helmerich, saying, "What do you need that you don't have yet?" On the very day that we had to make a final decision, one way or the other. They were going to put doors in, one way or the other. We had to make a final decision. And Walt called her and said, "Hey, I've got this amount of money. What do you need that you don't have?" And we were able to build those doors.
So then was that his foundation had contributed $150,000 and an additional $50,000, and then asked if there was another project and it would cost $14,000 or $15,000, and so there you had the door.
John, I've said this so many times, God knew what he was doing when he put the little lighthouse in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because I truly believe this has got to be one of the most, if not the most benevolent community on the planet.
I would say amen to that. April 7th, 1990 is a move-in day.
Yes, and I remember that we had needed sod. And so our board members, our staff members, and all the volunteers that we could round up, all of us were carrying sod. Sod is heavy. That was hard work. But we all got out there in our jeans and carried and laid sod down on that property to have sod. And it was a great, grand opening.
So that's April 30th of 1990?
1990.
And the first day of school and the new permanent home site. This has gone beyond Tulsa.
Yes.
First of all, in the United States, some other states that have modeled your plan.
Yeah, we now have a little lighthouse in central Mississippi, also in central Kentucky, and Lord willing, we're getting ready to open one in Oklahoma City. But it actually goes beyond that too, in that years ago, in fact, we're working on a third book right now that will share with our world how God, it's called God's Divine Connections, how God divinely orchestrated the beginning of our outreach to places around the world. I had never known conditions existed like they exist in many developing nations. I had never known the paradigm that existed toward children with special needs. I had never known that there are children with special needs that are taken out in Africa, that are taken out to the bush and left abandoned, left to die. I had never known there were children actually put to death because they're different. I hired an amazing young woman, Margie Stone. She was a licensed psychometrist, an occupational therapist, and a neurodevelopmental specialist. I was blessed to be able to hire her. But when I did, she said, I would love to come. I would love to serve as your educational director, but I'm committed to missions, and I will still want to take some short-term mission trips. If you will allow me to do that, I will come on staff. Now, I knew what a contribution she did make. So I allowed her to come on. And after her first mission trip, she came back. That day, center was closed. I was down there working by myself. She came in at that facility at 36th and Yale. And it was several years after we had built the building. God just so blessed us after that. We had computers in every classroom. We had state-of-the-art equipment. It was just amazing. Margie walked in. I said, we had sent with her, we'd had an overabundance of Crayolas and some little art supplies we'd sent with her on this mission trip. And I said, how did it go? And she's telling me all about it. And then she kind of sighed and she said, Marcia, we have so much here. And in other nations, they have nothing. She said, let me just give you an example. She said, the Crayolas you all sent, she said, we passed them out to the children. And they sat holding them in their hand. They had no idea what a crayon was or what to do with it. She said, Marcia, we've got computers in every classroom. We have got trained professionals that have so much to offer. Somehow we've got to reach out to our world. And Margie really, and God, really spoke to my heart that day. And I didn't understand it, but I felt that God was saying, I have done this so that you can reach around the world and impact your world, impact these children across the globe. And God just began to orchestrate. Probably the next significant step that occurred that we write about in this book is a young social worker in mainland, well, she was actually in Hong Kong, while it was still England, a part of England. She heard that in mainland China, in Nanning, China, that there were orphanages where the conditions were really, really deplorable. And she couldn't believe that it was true, what she was hearing. She just couldn't imagine. So she decided to go there, and she did. She found 5 babies to a crib, no diapers. The cribs were rusting. She found death rooms where they would take babies when they were dying and leave them, abandon them in those death rooms. Mm-hmm. And so it broke her heart. And so she had gone just for a day or two. She said she decided to stay. And at the end of the first day, she went to the director of this orphanage and she said, could I take a baby back to the hotel with me? Now, can you imagine that happening here? And he said, sure. So she said, I'd like to take this baby in the death room. He said, no, you don't want to take that. Take a healthy baby with you. And she said, I'd like to take that baby. And so she took that baby, took it back to the hotel, and she began to nurse it back to health. And stayed, extended her stay, and continued, and was able to nurse it back to health. Took it back and got another one, but then began to realize this one began to fail to thrive again because of the environment. Long story short, her name is Kit Ying Chan. There's been a Reader's Digest a story written about her. She became so frustrated with the whole situation that she thought, there's got to be something that can be done. I need homes. I need homes for these babies. And she began to do some research and found out that the required retirement age at that time for women in China was 45. And she thought, there's all these 45-year-old women and older out there that could be foster mothers to these babies. And so she went to the government and she proposed a foster parenting program, first ever there in China, and began a foster parenting program and began finding homes for these babies and making a huge difference. The particular official that she had worked with happened to be a very kind, caring individual, knew that they had a lot of children with special needs. And so he asked her if she had training in that area. And she said, "No, I don't." He said, "Can you get us training? We don't know how to help these kids." She didn't know, but she had graduated from University of the Nations in Hawaii, Youth with a Mission. So she contacted her dean in Hawaii. Okay, so now we've gone from Hong Kong to mainland China to Hawaii. She contacts this dean in Hawaii and asks her if they could provide. She said, "We've got an incredible opportunity here, and can you provide it?" Dr. Carol Boyd said, "No, we cannot. But I know somebody who might have an answer." So Dr. Boyd in Hawaii contacts Maureen Harbinson, a British lady who's now living in Canada, and asks Maureen if she happens to know of anyone who would be able to provide such help. Maureen has just returned from a trip to Tulsa where she volunteered at the little lighthouse. And Maureen says, "I know just the place." So Maureen tells her about it, and long story short, a few months later, 3 government officials, communist government officials from China who had never stepped foot in the United States, Maureen from Canada, Dr. Boyd from Hawaii, and Kit Ying Chen from China, and the head of her organization, Youth with a Mission, all come to the Little Lighthouse Tulsa, and that was the birth of our program, because they invited us to come to China to begin providing training to their people on how to work with children with special needs. And that was the beginning also of our understanding of the need to change the paradigm. So my role when I went was to share success stories of people with special needs. Oh my goodness, there's phenomenal success stories. There's the woman who has no arms that flies an airplane. There is, the kid with Down syndrome that's the movie star now. I mean, there's so many wonderful success stories of individuals with special needs. So I was able to share those success stories, including one about my own daughter. And one of our team members, who's a physical therapist, has a learning disability, and was able to share how she had overcome that. So just to give them a vision of what these people can do, So since that time, we have sent teams into 14 nations and provided training in 14 different nations. Now we have a online, let's call it the Academy. I don't know if they mentioned it at the luncheon, but it's called the Academy. And it is free online training in multiple areas of special education and therapy for anyone in the world. They can go on, and now therapists can even receive CEUs for those courses. We had 2 young men that came from Kenya, and they have now built a school. They started out with 14 students, and they now have hundreds of students that they are teaching. They will eventually move more into special ed. Right now, they've just started with kids that didn't have a chance to have school. When they were telling us about it, they said, they have to walk home 2 miles for lunch, and then they walk back 2 miles for the afternoon session. I said, why in the world, why don't they just bring their lunch? And they said, because their parents don't have their lunch yet. It takes them that morning time to be able to get food for them. So, yeah. So now we are reaching India, have reached Haiti, China, Philippines, Russia, anyway, many others.
With your expertise that goes there, and any funding obviously is provided by the countries or even the governments.
Sometimes the countries, and otherwise at this time and up to this time, we have continued only using earmarked funds for that.
Okay.
In other words, it's individuals who really want to see us reach children around the globe. Otherwise, the funds stay here in Tulsa.
Yeah. Well, I did visit the little lighthouse, had the luncheon and all. I was struck by the different programs that you had to accommodate the many needs. That was amazing to me, and I was thinking, well, how did you come up with that? But I suppose professionals were able to write a program for people or children at every different levels. I was struck by when the building seems to be not straight hallways. If those of you who drive by that building, there's a curve to it. And tell us why.
Our architect was aware that that children with autism don't do well with corners, and so he built the whole thing in a curve. So there are no like walk down the hall, take a left. It's all built on a curve. He used this approach, which has been amazing. In fact, I was leading a tour one day of a family from California. I did not know that the teenage daughter was on the spectrum. And the parents commented to me, they said, "She is so calm." They were just amazed at how calm she was as we were walking down this hallway. There's just something very calming about it. So yeah, just the very design of it was specially built. We have sensory rooms. I think probably one thing I would love our world to know, and one of the most unique things about the Little Lighthouse, besides the fact that it is Christ-centered and it's tuition-free, probably the most unique thing is the transdisciplinary team approach that we use. In other words, in most settings, a child would be in an educational setting and then they might be pulled out for physical therapy, brought back to the classroom, pulled out for speech therapy, brought back to the classroom, so on and so forth. Whereas we have speech therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, we have low vision specialists, we have assistive technology specialists, so many different kinds of specializations, and they all work together so that a child that is in the classroom being worked with by the physical therapist, the teacher can see what the physical therapist is doing with that child. When that physical therapist leaves, that teacher can continue that same thing, whereas a lot of times it's out of sight. And so vice versa. So the therapists and the teachers all work together as a transdisciplinary team. That's very, very difficult to find.
I was thinking the program is very faith-based. Are there people who come from other faiths and they say, that's fine, you want to talk about your faith, we talk about ours at home, but I really need your service? Does that happen?
Children from all faiths are welcomed at the Little Lighthouse. We have families from all different faiths. Our staff members are all Christians. They are all devoted followers of Christ. Our board members are as well. But our children come from all different walks of life and all different faiths.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about Missy now, today. Here we are, 2024. We're in November. How old is she now, and what is she doing?
She is 52, and she actually graduated from Oklahoma Baptist University, and then she was a music major, and for years she traveled the country doing contemporary Christian gospel concerts and sharing her testimony. One particular story I might share with you, when she was 16, she was really struggling because all the kids were getting driver's license, and she was really hurting badly. And so one night, I was already in bed. She came in, crawled up on my bed, tears streaming down her face. She said, "Mom, I need to know why." I said, "Why what, honey? Why? Why was I born like this? Why was I born with this visual problem? I need to know why." Because she couldn't get a driver's license. And I thought, where is my husband when I need him first? And then I prayed, and then I answered her this way. I said, "Darling, you can ask that question for the rest of your life, and you will probably never get a satisfactory answer because theologians have been debating that question for centuries. But if you will choose instead to change that question from why to how God can use your circumstances for good. He will show you great and mighty things, but you must ask him how. And in her testimony, in her concerts, she would share that night she went running back to God and found his arms open. And she began to ask him how he could use her circumstances for good. And he began to reveal to her that already he had used her circumstances for good by starting the little lighthouse and all the thousands of children who have been served because of her, but also that he could use her circumstances for good if she would share her testimony. So that's when she began doing concerts. She was just 16 at the time, but she started doing little concerts then.
Had she been singing as a child?
She had been taking voice, yes.
But as a child, did you notice it 5, 6 years old?
She took gymnastics initially.
Okay, but how do you start singing?
Which scared me, and she fell on the balance beam, and we started taking voice instead of gymnastics. And so she'd been taking voice for years. And of course then went on to Oklahoma Baptist University and majored in voice and music, graduated with a degree to be able to teach. And but for several years she did travel. She flew all by herself. I once said, "How in the world do you find your seat?" You know, that, because I knew she couldn't see those tiny numbers. And she said, "I just start visiting with somebody while I'm waiting and find out what seat they're in. I follow them on the plane, watch where they sit, and I can figure it out from there." And
so she can see?
She can see. She doesn't see as well as you or I. But at the age of 32, she called. She was living in her own apartment. And she called and said, "Mom, Dad, I have found a doctor at Johns Hopkins Hospital that is getting legally blind people driving, and I'm going there. I'm going with or without you, but I'd like for you to go with me." Well, when they're 32 and they've made up their mind, you kind of have to go along with it. And so I went with her, and long story short, he was able to fit her. This doctor was passionate that legally blind people should be able to drive if they could see the white lines of the road, if they could memorize the shapes of signs. You know, stop sign is a different color and a different shape than other signs. And if they could memorize those, they should be able to drive. He fitted her with state-of-the-art contact lenses and state-of-the-art glasses that had to be ground there. They couldn't even be ground in Oklahoma. And she came back and was able to get her driver's license. And so she's been driving since she was 32. She has never caused an accident in 20 years. And then years ago, it's about 12 years ago, she was working on her master's in counseling at Oral Roberts University, and one of her professors there suggested to her that she enter the Tyson Foods Gold Medal Mom Contest by entering an essay about her mom. And she didn't really pay attention to what the prize was or anything. She just thought, this would make a nice Mother's Day gift for my mom. And so I'll write something. Pretty good writer. So she wrote something, and we got notice that there were thousands of entries across the United States that we were in the finals for it. And Missy began to panic because the prize was 2 round-trip tickets to the Beijing Olympics. And turns out she won. Oh. So she calls her dad and said, "Dad, you and Mom are going to Beijing." And he said, "No, we're not. You're going to Beijing." Well, she was one who always said, "Look, I know you all like to go to the Philippines and China, all these different places, Russia. That's fine for you, but I'm called to the United States of America, where there's always hot water and electricity. So you all go, I'm staying here." And her dad says, "No, you're going to China." So we went to Beijing together. We were working with a center there. It was one of the many that I was mentioning that we had started working with, called New Day Center, a wonderful organization started by 2 Americans who left everything and went there and started a wonderful organization that takes children, Chinese children, orphans who have operable conditions that if they get the surgery, they can be adopted. If without it, they cannot, and or likely not. I had worked with them, had a relationship. I said, we've got to go visit. And so we went there, and they had, oh my goodness, I can't remember how many little tots. And Missy just lost her heart. And when we came back, she said, I want to be a mommy, and I want to adopt one of those. So we began to look into it, called Dylan. Dylan was a wonderful organization.
Jerry Dylan?
Dylan, Adoption Agency, yeah. We called Dylan, and Dylan said, we're sorry, they're closed. They will not allow single-parent adoptions. Missy's never married. Mr. Wright just had never come along. And so Missy said, well, we got to pray. Either God to raise up Mr. Wright or for him to change the Chinese laws. Now, wouldn't you think it would be easier to raise up Mr. Wright than to change the Chinese laws? But that's not what happened. He changed the Chinese laws over the next 2 years. 2 years later, a representative that I was working with, he had interns at the Lighthouse. He actually lives in China. And anyway, he was visiting, overseeing these Chinese interns, and he came into my office to visit with me about some things. And when he was leaving, he said, by the way, he said, was it your daughter that was looking into single-parent adoption, but they were closed? And I said, yeah. And he said, they've reopened. They're open to single-parent adoptions. I called Missy. She started that day, and 9 months later, we were on our way to China to get Kaylee. She had to have sponsors in other words, she had to have somebody for a backup plan if something were to happen to her. We're her backup plan. And so we all went to China to get our sweet Kaylee. And then a couple of years later, about a year and a half later, Missy said, I really think she needs a sibling because we were going to spoil her rotten. And so they began to look through, there's actually something called rainbowkids.com, and you can decide, you can say if you don't feel that you would be adequate to serve a child that's like 24/7 care, or visually impaired, or a CP. Well, anyway, Missy said she could take a visually impaired child. Anyway, Kaylee had said she wanted a baby sister. She said, you want a baby sister or you want a playmate sister, like an older sister like your age? She said, I want a baby. Well, Missy would go through these. She said, what do you think, Kaylee? You think this one? No, that's not my sister. No. What about this one? No, that's not my sister. And this went on for months. And one day Dylan called and said, we've got this kiddo. Her file's been locked, but it's just come unlocked. Do you want to take a look? I sent it to her. Missy opened it up. Said, Kaylee, this child was like, I said, Kaylee was 2, and this child was right at 2, and no, 3. They were 3. And so it's the same age, almost. And she said, what about this one? And Kaylee looked at it and went, oh, that's her. That's my sister. And I miss her. Well, where that came from, I don't know. But anyway, that was our Mia. They're 8 months apart. And we then, with Kaylee, went over to get Mia. And we're so thankful to have them.
Neither one of those were special needs, though, were they?
Kaylee had microtia of the left ear, meaning it's just a little tiny piece of an ear, and it's closed. So there's no hearing from that ear. And she also had corneal leucoma. When she was found in a warehouse district, a policeman had found her in a box. And they thought she was totally blind. Her eyes were swollen shut. The IE, which is what they call their nannies that took care of her at the orphanage, prayed over her and nursed her eyes back to health. So she wears glasses, but she can see, and she's a dancer. Anyway, Mia actually had spina bifida. And I thought, oh my goodness, she's gonna need the lighthouse, but our waiting list was forever long, and I thought she'll never make it in because I have to put her at the end. So I had talked to our therapist before we went, and I said, I'm going to probably be in touch with you. I said, I don't know what to expect. You know, she's spina bifida. So we got her. She was like Pillsbury Doughboy. She was just, there was no muscle tone at all. When we put her down, she walked with a shuffle. This child can't walk. And they had told us not to change their clothes until that night. When they change into their pajamas, because that makes them feel insecure. You kind of want to because nothing matches. And so, anyway, Missy put her pajamas on, took her shoes off, and Mia walked across the room like you or I would. And I was like, what? What is going on? She had shoes on that were 2 sizes too big.
Oh, my.
And she'd been trying to keep them on all day long. So those are our 2 sweet grands, and we just adore them.
Well, you just showed me a picture of them, and they're beautiful. So both of them were a special need.
Actually, technically, yeah.
Yeah.
But you would never know it today.
No. Well, you've written your book, which I read, and which is the reason I was able to lead you on this, Milestones and Miracles. I'd highly recommend it. You'll probably start reading it and can't quit. And then you have another, God's Work, God's Ways. You're a gifted writer and a speaker. You are called upon to speak, I know. And you have alluded to a 3rd book now that you're working on.
Divine Connections.
Right. You know, I was just thinking, that pediatrician who told you you're going to have to build it yourself,
Yeah.
he actually did you a favor.
Yes.
Because if he'd said, oh yeah, it's already built,
Yeah.
it's right over here, you'd have never had this journey.
No.
At all. None of it. So while it was
God
hard,
used him.
he did you a favor.
Yes, he did.
Right.
He did indeed.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing your story with us, and to Phil. I know he's in the house here somewhere that he can hear, because he was ever there with every step of the way for this story and what the little lighthouse means to our community and the thousands of children who have been affected. To finish this, I know there are many who have gone on to live good lives. Any unusual lives that developed because of the little lighthouse?
I think probably the one that comes most quickly to mind right now, Peter and Belden in Kenya, because they have made such an impact on so many children. And as we have gone over there to provide training, they have opened up other opportunities for countries that are bordering Kenya to come in. We have heard time and again the impact that it's had on the paradigm. Probably my favorite story of all that represents the paradigm shift in third world countries. I was present for, and I'm so glad that I was. We were in China. A hospital there had asked us to come, and we had taken a team of therapists and teachers. They were very clear they did not want us to talk about our faith, but we were there to teach. And there were caregivers, doctors, nurses, parents. There were hundreds there at this. So we had done about a full day of sessions. And the next day we had done like the morning sessions, and we decided that afternoon to allow people to come to the microphone and just talk about maybe what they had learned or any impressions they had had. And this one sweet little Chinese lady had very broken English, but had a little bit of English, came to the microphone, and she said this: "Where I come from, we have always seen these children as trouble. But since you have come and you have been teaching us, we now see these children as flowers with potential to blossom." So we thank you for that. And that's our dream, that we can help our world to see these children are flowers with the potential to blossom. And I have seen time and time again these children transform the lives of families. I don't think I have ever met a sibling that I didn't have tremendous respect and admiration for. These children mold their siblings into precious and devoted, unselfish, amazing human beings. I've never seen an exception to it. There may be, but I've never seen an exception to it, and I've been exposed for 50 years now. The parents are transformed. And these families will tell you they would not trade, no matter how, even 24/7, no matter how much they have to pour, no matter how many days and nights they have to spend in hospitals, et cetera, they are transformed, and they would not trade a minute with these precious children. So there's a book written years ago that actually transformed my life because it's so connected with me because of the loss of my little sister, but it's called Angel Unaware. And Dale Evans Rogers wrote this book and tells a story of how their little girl, what Dale believes their little girl might have told our Heavenly Father shortly after she joined him in heaven, and talks about her earthly mission. And I believe God uses these children if families will open their hearts, and if our world will just open our hearts to hear these children have such valuable lessons to teach us.
Yeah. Many who listen to this now will be taught, and we hope that we can hear others, have others say, I didn't even know that was available in our town. Thank you. Thank you for telling the story for Voices of Oklahoma.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Voices of Oklahoma podcast. Stories taken from the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com. At the website, you will discover an array of storytellers. Many you will know. Some will be new to you, but all will be worth your time. This work depends on listeners like you, who are interested in learning about the great people of Oklahoma. Our website provides an opportunity to donate to this 501c3 project, which preserves Oklahoma history, one voice at a time. voicesofoklahoma.com.